My Army service record. My friend Dennis Jones come over here to help me, and we're trying to tape my Army service record. I was supposed to be inducted into the Army the 4th of 4th of March 1944, and that way I was ready to go. I was 21, ready to go. And the evening of the 4th, there came a big snow. There was about 18 or 19 inches of snow. And there was part of us, just a few of us, made it to Harrisville. But the buses stalled up at West Union. They couldn't make the hill up there to haul us out. And at that time, it was only a 2-lane road through Ritchie County. Of course, now we have the 4-lane, but they couldn't get on over to Harrisville. So from there, we got to Fort Thomas, Kentucky, the 12th of March, 1942, and there we got all of our shots and just about everything. We went down the line, one on each side, giving us shots and physicals of all kinds. And then we went back to we was there for 2 or 3 days and got our Army serial numbers and all the paraphernalia to get started to the Army. And then a few days after that, they divided us up into 2 groups. And we went, there was a bunch of Fort Thomas, or Camp Livingston, Louisiana, to the 28th Infantry Division, and then there was a bunch that went to the 45th Division. I forget what state they was in, but they were a little different than ours. It was divided about equal, except one person, Lloyd Dotson, was the only person that was left out of the 2 groups. He stood there and watched us all pull out, and he didn't have any idea where he was going, but he went, I believe, to the Navy and took up electrician work. But the ones of us went to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. It was the 28th Infantry Division, and we had our 12 weeks basic training. We close order drilled and hiked 25-mile road marches. Of course, we didn't do that till toward the last of our training, but we really kept busy down there, and it was so hot, and it had been cold, a bad winter here in West Virginia, and our faces sunburned where our caps let the sun in on the forehead, and noses sunburned and scabs peeled off, and we got a lot of this prickly heat on our backs where we wore packs, and it was pretty miserable training down there. We went through the infiltration court, and there was a lot of things. Every morning and at noon we had a pass and review. We had a band. We marched to pass the high officials in the service, and we had to give them the eyes right and salute. And if anybody was out of step, it sure showed up, and there would be somebody come and pick him up, and he would have to go to sick call or take him out of there and close order drill him some more, and just a lot of extra work. And we had one person, Harry Collins, was with us, and he was sort of crippled in the knees, and they would pick him up out of the march out every morning, and they'd take him, and they noticed he was limping that way, and they would take him to sick call, and the sick call would mark him light duty, and our company commander would say, "No light duty in this outfit," and he'd send him back out, and then that way he sure didn't fit in that outfit. But we chained there till in the latter part of the year, like November or something like that. And we were shipped then to Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida. And of course, I was one of these persons that liked to look around a lot. And first thing when we got there, of course, I went swimming. And it was nice and warm there. And I think it was on a Saturday we got there or something, and I went swimming. And the next day was Sunday. They asked us if any of us would like to go for a boat ride. And of course, I did. Of course, I jumped in one of these landing barges, and out through there we took in the water. And my goodness alive, I didn't realize it, but here these boat boys, they was all mad. They didn't understand what the world we want. And of course I didn't either. This was an amphibious outfit that I'd signed up for, and the very next day they took us out on there. But that was a detail for these boys that was running the boats, and they didn't appreciate it too much, but we had a nice boat ride, and everything went real good on that. And come back, and then the next morning was lined up and marched down to the docks, and everybody had to get on the boats then. But anyhow, we had a lot of amphibious training from there. A lot of our problems were, they called them problems. There was a place called Dog Island. It was about 15 or 20 miles off of the main line, the main land, and we a lot of times would get on the boats about midnight down there, and then go out and anchor down someplace and leave those old diesel engines running all night long. And that old diesel engine, the smell, and they'd give us these big thick salami sandwiches. And there's one time that I'll tell you that I kept feeding the fish. They would always make me sick. But I did that time after time. And then we always made the famous dawn attack on the island, and then we'd march all over that island the rest of the day, and then probably bivouac over there at night. And then the next day we'd make an attack on the land, the main land, about the same as we did the time before, because we went out. And the training there was awful tough. It was awful sandy. Our barracks did not have any toilet. Was inside. They was all outside, and they used these big trash cans, and there was people hauled them away every day. And we did a lot of marching there. These 25-mile road marches, I tell you, they was rough down there, especially where the sand was. And we would make them, when it got so hot, we would make them at night, start in about 6 o'clock in the evening. You'd march for about an hour, then you'd come to a place that had a big sign up over the road, starting point. That's before you'd even got started on the march. And then you'd go out, you'd march till about midnight or shortly after, and they'd bring our dinner out. We'd have an hour's break, and then start back in. And if ever a man fell out of the squad leader had to make a make-up march on Tuesday. You always made these marches on Friday. And if a man fell out of your squad and couldn't make it, you'd just as well fall out with him, because you had to go on another march on Tuesday. We had one big old boy in the outfit. He was from Kentucky, about three-quarter Indian, and he'd always get down the road a hollering, "Oh Lord, you raise them up and I'll set them down." Just for a good while that way he'd do that, and he'd go about 10 or 15 miles and he'd drop out. He always had to be a BAR man, and that's a pretty heavy gun. It weighed about 20 pounds. But on one occasion where we marched out like that, I remember that you know, you tried to help your buddy, and one of the boys was getting back in on the finishing line. I mean, we'd finished the march, but there was about 2 miles or 3 before you got to your barracks. And this fellow was just barely dragging. And I know I took part of his equipment, and we broke his equipment up and put it on our backs, and we helped him and come on in. And we got to the barracks, they hollered chow, and this boy and I, neither one could make it to the chow table that morning. We both sat there and turned around and opened blood blisters on each one of our feet. There was great big blood blisters, as big as a quarter, I believe, on both of us. And I tell you, they was rough. You always had sand in your shoes. And Camp Gordon Johnson, I'll tell you, was a place to be. At one time, there was a French officer came over to watch us in our training, and I don't know just the month or anything it was, but I'll tell you one thing, there was a terrible storm. I never was around the ocean when there was a storm like that. The wind blew, the lightning, and it rained, and it was, the waters was awful rough, and we were supposed to go out on the ocean and then him to watch us make the attack on the land. There was one boatload that did get out, but they were lost, and they didn't know where they was at. There was no control of their landing barge, and 14 men in a boat to land, and all 14 of them were drowned. The next morning they washed into the they had a sort of a gateway. They had a sandbar on each side, and there was a gateway between them that they come into the to the landing bar, to the piers, and the boys come out there and they hit the landing barge, or they hit the sandbar, and they thought they'd hit land, and they unloaded off of their boats, and of course as they went in toward the piers farther, it got deeper and the waves was so rough, and every one of them drowned, and they were forced into the piers there at our camp. And we watched them get down the next morning with ambulances, army ambulances, back out on the piers and taking the dead up out of there. And you know, they had one very amusing place to go there that was called Waukeela Springs, and it was a place where we go to. It had been burned down. There was just a little building there, and people were running. They had the glass covered bottom boats, and we'd go out on them. And there was one place that was like sailing out over a big cliff, like he's a flying, and you could see down in the water, I believe it was 186 feet deep, and you could drop a penny in there and you could watch it hit the bottom. On all sizes of fish, clear from the top clear to the bottom. And there was another thing that happened every day. I don't know, I reckon it did. This old boy in this boat, he had a fish out there he called Henry, and it was there was a stick laying over a hole in the ground under the water, and every day, or whenever we went out there, he would go out there around there and he'd call old Henry. And I'm telling you, that fish would come out and go under that pole in that valley of water, and he'd have to turn sideways. He was too thick to go under the right way up, but that fish would just turn sideways and swim out around. And after a while he'd come back and he'd get through the same way again. And it just time after time that he'd do that. And anyhow, it was a great experience down there. Florida was a rough place, but it was a lot of good experience too, I guess. Okay, when I was in Florida, I got a furlough. And even when I was in Camp Pickett, or Camp Livingston, Louisiana, I got a furlough. I want to tell you about this furlough in Camp Livingston. I got on a train and come through clear into Parkersburg, and it wasn't too bad. Everything went real nice on it. And I got into Parkersburg, and you know, when I got there at the station, here was a bunch of boys from Pennsboro that were there getting on a train to leave for the Army. And there was one of the boys come around, "Hey, Denning, where in the world did you get your uniform?" And then he says, "Look," well, he says, "No," he says, "you're not Jack, are you?" I says, "No." "Is Jack here?" He says, "Yeah, he's down along the line there." And I went down, and here my brother Jack was. He's waiting to go to the Army. He was on his way to the Army, and here I was coming home on the furlough, and I got to see Jack there for, a half hour or so. The last time I saw him until after the war was over. But down in Florida, anyhow, I got a nice furlough from there. What they did was, starting the furloughs, they started with the last name A. Anyone started with A down to, I don't know, B or C or D or F, I don't know, in there someplace. All of them that had the name start that way would get their furloughs, and you know, that's the way they went there for a while. Then the next thing, we moved and they canceled all the furloughs. And down in Florida, and they started it out again. And I was lucky enough to, my name D, or Denning, was lucky enough to get a furlough the first bunch, and then they hollered so much they had to start at the bottom again to give furloughs. The furlough that I got from Florida, I got on a train down there, and it was the slowest thing. I forget how many days of coming. But I'm telling you, it was a long time. I spent, I think, 2 or 3 nights on the train. It stopped and picked up cream and chickens and everything else clear along. It was a work train, and it was really a rough time. But anyhow, from there, after we left Florida, we went to Camp Pickett, Virginia. And Camp Pickett, Virginia was an awful nice camp. It was really nice, but they still kept our amphibious training up. We trained for about 2 years for the invasion of France. But General Bradley was our division commander at one time, and he said our division was too good to waste on the beaches of France when they started out for D-Day. But anyhow, I always appreciated that, I can tell you that right now. But there in Camp Pickett, Virginia, we had an awful lot of amphibious training, and the first thing we knew, they had a great big wall built up with rope ladders on it. And we went up and down them ladders day after day, a full field of equipment and all the things that goes with that. And we did a lot of the things like that. And then we went, first thing we knew, one morning we loaded on a landing barge and went way out in the ocean there, and you know, we saw a big boat out there, and the first thing we knew, we went up to this boat, and it was a rainy, bad day, awful bad day. And anyhow, when they got the landing barges up to the boat, then we went up rope ladders up to clear up to the deck, and then we got on the deck of this ocean-going vessel, and then we went into up at Pennsylvania, Baltimore, up the channel there. What is the name of that channel? I just can't think of it. Chesapeake Bay. We went up into the Chesapeake Bay in this ocean-going vessel, and it was raining cats and dogs, and the wind was blowing, the waters was rough. And whenever we made a famous dawn attack from the ocean, from the ocean-going vessel. We come down that ladder and got on these landing barges, and boy, you had to watch on them. When the waves was down, you'd be way down, and the next thing, the wave would pick the boat up, and it'd 12 or 14, maybe 20 feet. The waves would be that high, and boy, it'd rake you off of the side of the big ship, and if you was clear up on top. As soon as you touched the landing bars, you had to let loose because it might go way down. And you really had to be careful not go down between the ship and the landing bars, because you was in trouble if you did that. Then we made a famous dawn attack up in the Chesapeake Bay, and the first thing we did, we hit the beaches, and then here come some fellow with a flag. He said we was dead. They had artilleried us, and we sat there on the beach for a good while. And then the next thing, they marched us out of there into a field, and a lot of times mosquitoes. I've been around where they was at. We had mosquito netting and everything, but mosquitoes would really never bother me much. But they had a little tiny mosquito up there that, I mean to tell you, that eat us up. We were really tough on us up there. Them mosquitoes was the worst I ever saw in my life. And I know we went through a cornfield, and we picked a lot of corn off and ate them, raw corn. And from there, we went back to our camp, and they was getting ready to send us overseas. And anyhow, we left Camp Pickett and went someplace to turn it off. Okay, and when we left Camp Pickett, Virginia, we went to a camp in Texas, and there they checked all of our records. It was an embarkation point, and they checked all of our records there. And there's one thing that really stayed with me. In that whole division, there was 2 men that never had the 10,000 insurance. And the first thing I knew, here was there about 2 days. First thing I knew, there was a runner come down and wanted one of the boys from my squad, and he come in, and he wasn't one of these type that would do just exactly as Hoyle, like the Army wanted it. He come in and asked the captain, he said, "What do you want?" And that just don't go over good. And he explained to him that he didn't have the 10,000 insurance, and he was from West Virginia, up around west and up in there someplace, and his father had been killed in a coal mine accident of some kind. But anyhow, his mother told him if he wanted to spend the money, it was all right with her. He'd made 5,000 to her, but he hadn't made the full 10,000. And anyhow, as soon as he came back, they called for another fellow, and he was from Pennsburg. His name was Lamb, and he only had 5,000 insurance. 2 men in the whole division that didn't have the 10,000 insurance, and they was both in my squad. So it ended up that he went up and reported, and he got along real good. But then the next thing I knew, the fellow came down and called for me. So I went back to the headquarters and reported, and saluted, and I noticed that the captain made me stand at attention there for a good while. You're supposed to give your name and your rank and reported as usual, or reported as ordered. And he finally, he told me, he says, "Sergeant, you know," he says, "you have a man in your squad that needs some discipline." He says, "He come in here and asked me what the world I wanted, and what the world he wanted. And he says he ought to know better than that." And this fella, he never thought of anything like that. He just went in and asked me what he wanted. And anyhow, after that, we was loaded on trains again, and we went to Camp Miles Standish in Boston. It's right close to the harbor, and it was an embarkation point, and we had our horseshoe roll and our barracks bag. Anything that you had to move, buddy, you had it on your bag. And we got in there one evening, and they let us. We had to bunk up that night and everything. And there was a boy, one of the boys that was in the squad, he wanted somebody to with him to went with him to buy a fifth. And I never could drink whiskey, but I went in and helped buy it. Anyhow, I took a taste of it, but about 3 hours that we'd give this taxi cab driver our money, and it was 2 or 3 hours before he come back, and the whole back end of his taxi cab was filled with liquor. And I'm telling you, he gave us ours. I took a little sup out of it, and my buddy, he drank pretty much all the rest of it, and he got sick. I mean sick. They had a crap game that night, barracks, and the first thing I knew, one of them threatened to work out on the other one, and this boy that had drank the whiskey just threw up. I got it all over him. I mean, he was in an awful mess. But anyhow, the next morning when we got up, I got him out of bed and got him out there, and we had to answer a roll call, first name, middle initial, last name. Last name, first name, middle initial, and then your Army serial number. We had to answer with all that. And when they came down through our outfit and they got to my outfit, they called my name, and then 2 or 3 after that they called his name, the boy that was drunk. And they called his name, and he answered, and I took him by the arm, and we went down to the shower, and he went in a cold shower. He couldn't hardly walk. We had to help carry his load to get him back on the ship. In about an hour, we was loaded on a ship, a big convoy. The Cristobal was the name of the ship that we went over on. We was 16 days going over. We went to England, and of course, out in the middle of the ocean, buddy, we was in a large convoy. We could count, I believe it was 60 ships. When the waters was smooth around, there was destroyers, there was a little bit of everything. But anyhow, there came a bad storm, and there was a lot of them got sick. And during the storm, every one of us had to stand guard one night on the ship, and the boy in the crow's nest says, I see a light. And he told what direction, and then the captain, somebody asked him about it 2 or 3 times, and he said, there it is again. And he came down, and I believe he stayed up in the crow's nest, but anyhow, one of my boys was on guard. He heard him report it. But anyhow, there was depth charges dropped that night, and boy, I'll tell you, they really shook a boat too. And that big long rope that hangs from the side of the ship, from the one end to the other, the ship had tipped over one way some, and then when it come back, that rope hit that side of that ship, and boy, it sounded like a cannon. I thought sure that we'd been hit with a torpedo or something like that, but it wasn't. It was just a big rope that come back there. And anyhow, we sailed on into Southampton, England, and then from there we were taking the train. But on this ship, I want to tell you about, there was one of the boys got seasick. He got so sick, and he started gagging and trying to throw up, and he actually died from seasickness. And one of our company clerk was with him when they landed in England with his body, and they was taking it someplace to bury the body, and the officials caught him, and he didn't have proper papers, and they had him locked up for 2 or 3 days before they could really get the messages through and everything that what it was he was supposed to be doing. But anyhow, from there we went to South Wales in England, and the Welsh-speaking people, and they come the nearest to speaking the language that you can't understand of any people that I ever saw. But anyhow, we we trained there. We kept Amphibious Division. We was at Fishguard Harbor and Tembe there in England. Fishguard Harbor was a pretty place. It had been a place where the boats come in and everything, but they hadn't been using it that way lately for a good while. I don't know, but anyhow, the harbor, the ocean place was filled up. They hadn't drained it out, and it was just mucky and muddy in there. When the tide come in, it'd hide and everything, but when the tide go back out, it'd just be mud all over the harbor. And it was such a nice place. And anyhow, there was Fishguard Harbor was a place that I really remember that. We went on one of the boys in my squad and I always went out together on Saturdays. And we went someplace, I forget where it was, but we went someplace and got a bracelet that I mailed to my sister, Mary Lee. I think she still has that bracelet. Anyhow, I was going to go back the next day, or the next weekend, and something happened. There was training that all the officers and non-coms, most all of them was supposed to take and qualify with a .45 pistol on the range, and they left all the riflemen, and I was in charge of the whole company. And it ended up with a buddy of mine, and he was a real good buddy. He and I used to run around together all the time. The next morning at roll call, he would not get up. He absolutely would not get up. And I had to report that I went ahead and reported all present or accounted for. But I went to the company commander and told him that I had a man that was supposed to, that I wanted to put on detail, and told him what had happened. The next weekend when we were supposed to go back, I always wanted to get there was a big fork and sort of brass or maybe gold looking fork and knife. And I don't know whether it's spoon. I wanted to always get that and send it to my mother. And I didn't have the money when I was there the week before, but when I went back this time I was going to get that thing. And I had to put my buddy on KP over the weekend, and I never did get back. Anyhow, we never did get that. And while I was there in England, I mean to tell you, it was rough training. They even issued us those hobnailed shoes. There was great big headed nails that they drove in the bottoms of your shoes, and you just sound like a horse going down the street. And tell you, when you was a marching step, we really raised the rumpus. And we marched, kept our amphibious training up. We kept landing barges and going out in the waters in the rough and marches and all kinds of training there. And then we was at a place called Marlborough in England, and there we were living in pup tents in a little woods, and they had a mock city around there, just little tiny lights around on different hills. And for the Germans, they thought that they might take and bomb that, and we were right in the middle of that. They had it for a mock city to keep them from bombing some of their main cities. There was a lot of bombing in England about that time. I'd been to London 2 or 3 different times. But anyhow, we were there at Marlborough, England, and there's one thing about it I'll never forget: the rabbits. There were so many rabbits. Around here we have rabbit holes in the sinkholes and down in little hollows and stuff. But those holes was out on a point. And you could go out there in the evening and there'd be dozens of rabbits running around, just dozens of them. And there was a man that used to run a trap line there, and he had something like a little Model A Ford pickup, and he would have the back end of his pickup half full of those rabbits, and he'd get down to the cities there are hollering a rabbit for sale, a shilling a piece. They really, England, they didn't have much meat, and there's a lot of people who buy the rabbit, fish, and rabbit was about the only thing I think the kind of meat that they could get a hold of. And while we was there at Marlborough, the first of the outdoor theaters that I ever saw, they'd been having some pictures there. They had a big screen set up and a bunch of logs laying around to sit on. They had a whole bunch of them pulled out there. Anyhow, one evening I decided I want to show. Of course, we had to wait till dark, and of course, if it was an air raid siren or something like that, you'd have to shut it off till it was blowing all clear. But anyhow, I went to out there early in the evening, and got there and got me a seat and sat down there and waited till it got dark. I had to wait about a couple hours. You had to if you ever got a seat. So I was sitting there, and the next thing, one of my boy and my squad that I was bunked with come running over, and hey, says Fremont, there's a boy from Pennsburg here wanting to see you. I says, you're kidding. No, and of course I got took out of there, and I'd registered every once in a while when we would go someplace in the Red Cross books. I'd register and sign my name and company and everything, address. And I took back over, and there was about 12 of us boys from Ritchie County hit action together. And here was one of the boys there, you know, and of course I went past the other boys' places and went to hollering, somebody over here from Pennsburg, somebody from Pennsburg. And about a half a dozen of us or so crowded around there, got to my bunking place, and here was Beach Collins from Pennsburg. And he stayed there and visited with us. Tears come in his eyes. He says, I've only got one other fellow from West Virginia, and he was a drunk from up around Wheeling, up in that direction someplace. And he was so glad to see us. It was Charles Eisner, Raymond Moore, and Benny Jones. And there were just a bunch of us from Pennsburg. And then there was 3 from Cairo, and there was 3 from Smithville was all with us. Had a nice visit. The next Sunday I went to visit the beach. And while we was there, we was hauled in close Southampton there someplace, and here was General Eisenhower in there inspecting his invasion troops. And of course we were right in the midst of it, so we was hauled in there, and General Eisenhower at that time come around and would speak to people, and he was so nice and he was so pleasant. But that's one of the things that happened to me there. And another thing that I remember pretty distinctly, one evening at retreat, you know, we always had arms inspection, and our platoon leader was always the first. He was a swell fellow. We had one of the nicest in the country, and he'd always go around just randomly pick up 1 or 2 of the fellows and inspect their rifles, you know. But you know, this time he come up to me, squad leader. He come up and stood before me, and here I had to come and attention and inspection arms and hand him a rifle. I hadn't cleaned it, I know. I expect for a day or 2, and anyhow he turned it upside down and shook it. He says, you ought to shake the dirt out of it once in a while anyhow. And just a few days after that, or probably a week, one Sunday morning, here come the CQ around. Hollered, Sergeant Denning, come out here. And here he gave me a whole list of names. He says, hunt these up and fall out here on Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. And my goodness alive, everybody was mad. I was mad, and every one of the fellows that I had to wake up and bring out, they was all mad. And here was the lieutenant, and come in out there, and he was out of humor, and we had to go out back on a hill and spend the whole day. The truck come in out there with mattocks and shovels. They wasn't our little picks that we carry on our back and shovel. They were big mattocks and shovels, and here we had to skin off the dirt and dig foxholes and mortar emplacements and machine gun emplacements and get those down deep enough. They had to skin them off and then skin all the sod off and then dig your hole and then put the sod back over it, camouflage it. And they said at 3 o'clock or sometime like that, the tanks would come over and run over top of you, and they run over you. But we had them all dug down. They made us dig them pretty deep. And then you had to get down and hunker down. But boy, the first thing we knew, here come them tanks are rumbling in. And buddy, they was there, and they run over catty corners in every direction that you'd think. They were our tanks, and buddy, you had to get down and stay down. Of course, it put a lot of dirt down your neck and everything like that, but buddy, I had a big experience of that anyhow. The tanks ran over several times. And from there, we was still there, and we was on a 5-minute alert. We were supposed to win several times there while we were there. We would be the enemy for our paratroopers and our all the Air Force gliders and everything like that. We would be dug in and hid and everything, and they'd come over and drop the paratroopers on us and the gliders around. And of course, the last time we was there, they said the next time they ever saw us up in force, you'll know that it's a real thing, that the invasion would have taken place. And anyhow, that's what happened there. We was all around there. Marlboro was one of the big places. There was a large hospital there, and that's where the wounded, after D-Day, when they came back, they came to that hospital. It was their first stop, and that's where while I was at Marlborough, England, where I was telling you about all these rabbits, my brother-in-law, Ed Palmer, told about the Americans shipping over rabbits with rabbit fever to kill them, to get rid of so many rabbits that they were so harmful to all their crops. They just eat up everything, and you just couldn't battle them. But anyhow, that's one of the things that happened there at Marlborough. And then from Marlborough, we went on the, I don't know the port, but anyhow, we loaded on the ships and went on over to France. After D-Day on June the 7th, we never went out for a drill that day or anything. We stayed inside and we watched the planes coming back over, some of them with one motor out or maybe two motors out, and a lot of them was dragging ropes from the gliders, and we knew that the invasion had happened. And about 10 o'clock or something like that, they announced us and told us that they had made a beachhead. And we were the only amphibious division left in the 1st Army in reserve, and we were supposed to be able to go out in 5 minute time to wrap everything up and go out and never leave any trace of who it was there or anything about it. But anyhow, we left from there and went and got on a boat and went on over into France. I believe it was probably around the 25th of June, and there were still boats floating around in the ocean there on the beach, and they still had these big metal things up to protect the beach. They looked like jacks that you play jacks with as a kid, only they were about 6 feet high, some of them, ones right close to the beach, the land, to keep the boats from coming in. They were scattered clear along the beach, and they had these great big pillboxes, and there was a big cliff, and these pillboxes were sitting on these cliffs, and they went in and bombed them, and about halfway up the hill, maybe a little more than halfway up, the Americans was in there digging graves. They were hauling the dead back on something like a pickup, a 3/4 knee job. Men was wrapped in blankets. They got us up on top of the flat, and the first thing they did was rush the police up. And I was so mad. I thought, boy, oh boy, the war's over and here we are, and the policing up outfit will be here 2 or 3 years and so forth and on. But you know, it just didn't work that way. Anyhow, they pulled us on up there for a little ways, probably 8 or 10 miles, and the first thing I knew, it kept bombing, and there's a lot of activity around. We had to fill up split trenches and pick up trash there. From the next thing, here come this bed check Charlie over, a German plane. It was just like sounded like a washing machine motor, and he would come along and just treatable. And they had guns set up out there. They had, I think, 6 or 8 guns on a truck, and they was scattered every place around there, and they would be firing tons of shells at that fellow, and he'd just go putting along there, and they had crisscross fire and everything. I don't see how they kept from hitting him, but he did. This bed check Charlie was a reconnaissance plane the Germans sent over, and he would try to spot our troops and everything. And that was right close, well, where we first hit combat. Before we hit combat, they took some of the officers and put them up to watch them bomb St. Lo. It was about 40 miles from the beach, and that's where the Germans went back there for rest periods and so forth and on. Their past town was St. Lo, and the Americans come over to bomb that. And the thing that there was a bunch of the higher ranking officers went up close on a hill someplace, and they were to watch them bomb St. Lo, and these planes came over, and they're what they called shuttle bomb. They dropped a smoke bomb, and they was all in a certain kind of formation and everything, and then they went over, and whenever a lead plane hollered drop them, they dropped them. But the thing that happened, they went over, this fellow that dropped the bomb, the smoke bomb, blew back on our own troops, and they come in all at once, hollered drop them, and they dropped bombs on our own men. There was a General McNair that was killed there on that day, of our own men. But anyhow, the next day they come over, and they really flattened that place. They been dive bombed it, and it was a town as big as Parkersburg or Clarksburg, or a little bigger, and you couldn't have went in a building any place and have taken a shelter in it. And just a couple days after that, I went through it on trucks. We was going toward the front line. They had dozers in there scraping the streets off and piling the rubbish up. And the first 2 dead Germans I ever saw was at the outlet. That just was leaving St. Lo. They'd come in there on motorcycles, and somebody had got them. But anyhow, there was 2 dead Germans laying by the roadside. And then they took us on past there a little ways, and we began to hear some artillery, and they unloaded us off of trucks, and then we went from there on up to a place and regrouped and got ready, and we went in and relieved 29th Division. They had tried to take a place, the name of Percy in France. It was probably 60 or 70 miles from the beach. And the 29th Division had failed the day before to take it. And our division commander said that we could take it. And it was a town, it wasn't too big a place, there was a railroad through it, the town and everything. But anyhow, we relieved the 29th Division, and at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, supposed to attack this town. But you know, at 4 o'clock, the Germans threw the counterattack on us, and we didn't get to start out till about the 7 or maybe 8 o'clock. But anyhow, we started out through there, and this is in these hedgerows. There in France, just a rock fence with a lot of brush on top of it. They've been there for years, and you just couldn't get through it. They had bars and gates go from one field to another. You couldn't go over the hedgerows. But anyhow, we got in positions and started out, and I just went through about 2 or 3 fields, and the first thing I knew, there was 3 or 4 mortar shells let right in. We were just starting through a gate, and there's where I got my first wound. It was in the chin. There was 3, myself and 2 of my gunner, and an ammunition carrier was all hurt. The ammunition carrier was Westfall from John Edward John Edward Westfall from Frisco, California. And I looked back at him, and there had been some shrapnel hit just above, just on his forehead. Evidently it went under his cap. He must have been falling down, and it just, there, his face was all bloody. And then there's Barger Huff, and up here at Jane Lou. He says, Denning, he says, my leg's broke. I told him no, it wasn't, and I helped him take his leggings off and boot. And anyhow, I looked at it, I said, can you move your toes? And he said, yeah. He moved his toes in good shape. I told him it wasn't broke. And look, I knew a piece of shrapnel hit me and it knocked me down. There was a hole in my field jacket, and I raised it back, and here my chest was bleeding. And next thing, medicos come, and then they hollered for litter bearers, and Westfall and myself walked back, and I even helped carry Barger Huff a little ways. His leg was broke. And anyhow, when I went back a little ways, I was helping carry Barger Huff, and one of them grabbed me. He says, no, he says, you can't do that, that's serious. They had me marked serious, and they took me back to a field hospital, and as the doctor looked at it, and he said, oh, nothing in that. That's all right. He sent me back to the front line. I had to go back in about 2 or 3 days. Went back to the front lines, and there, we didn't get Percy that day. We went in there, and part of the fellows even got down to the railroad track, but it was in a sort of a bottom and back on the hill that was facing us. The Germans was back there, and they never fired any on us. We formed skirmish lines and went down and through there, everybody a firing, and the first thing we knew, they didn't even do anything until we got clear down into the city, and then they opened up on us. And oh my, the boys had to retreat, and when you retreat, you're supposed to, 2 of you work together, one of you look toward the enemy, let the other one run back about 25 yards, and he covers you while you run. And anyhow, a little while after that, they was orienting us on this, and telling us what we did about attacking Percy and so forth and on. And then they said we had to make a hasty withdrawal. But one of the boys from Kentucky, never forget him, he spoke up. He said, by God, back in Kentucky, we call it running. And that's sure what happened. But anyhow, after we got Percy, got up on the other side of the hill, and you know, the Germans sent up a truckload of soldiers to help defend it, and it was just a little narrow road, just a farm road between a couple of hedgerow fences. And here we set up a machine gun and a BAR in the hedgerow fence covering the road. And just shortly after midnight, one of the boys that was on guard says, "Listen, we hear something coming." And sure enough, down this hill, there come a German loaded with soldiers. And there was one man walking in front of it that had these little blackout lights. He didn't know that the town Percy had fallen. He didn't know that we had it. He come walking down through there and walked right in. So the boys just opened up, and I'll tell you, that was a pretty messy job right there. And that's one thing I always was scared of, getting hauled around on trucks after that. But anyhow, we went clear through there on into France, so many different battles and marches and so forth and on. But that was in June, July. But anyhow, we had a lot of different battles from there on up. But I'm going to skip those. I'm going into, we was up close to Paris, and knew we was up on the front lines, and the front lines was awful. There was a lot of hard fighting. The Germans would give up in one section, and they'd leave one or two men while the rest of them retreat and so forth and on. But anyhow, first thing I knew one night, about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening after dark, they hollered, "We're moving out, boys. Here we come." We went back, and the first thing I knew, here was trucks. And we loaded on trucks, and they took us into Paris. And we was liberating Paris. If you ever saw the pictures of it or anything, it was a disgusting time for me. They hauled us in there, got us in there a little after midnight or something like that. I don't know whether it was a cemetery or a park or something. Anyhow, we could get up around anyhow, and we hadn't been able to do that from the front. But it was a rainy, bad night, and the first thing I knew, they told us to bunk down and be out by 7 o'clock in the morning. And we'd be all clean shaven, all clothes, shoes shined, and polished up the best you could. We was going to have a parade there in Paris. And boy, had to shave in cold water, and I slept in a place where the water ran in on me. I had a raincoat, but it was full the next morning. Anyhow, they got us up, and we shaved and cleaned up and had our mess for breakfast, and then fell out in line. We stood there for a couple of 3 hours, and first thing you knew, and back and eat dinner, and then fall out again. And about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they started the parade. And up 24 abreast and run double time, high port arm, and double time past a reviewing stand, and all the high officers, the French and English, and Eisenhower and Bradley and all the armored man, Blood and Gus Patton. He was there. I don't know, there was 8 or 10 generals and highfalutin men there. But we had to run past them, high port and double time, and we started on right down. They divided us off in streets. Some of them would fall off on one street, and the next thing you'd fall out on another street. Each company went down a different street over a couple miles, and we kept running that way till first thing we knew in the afternoon, and they slowed down and got started again at regular time. And just as we got in the outskirts of Paris, then the small arms fire broke out. But anyhow, we was there for a day or two through there fighting, and then we went to a town by the name of St. Quentin. they had us on trucks, and we were supposed to go some distance on this truck, and then the first thing I knew, they stopped. And anyhow, I never saw a thing like this happen before, but there was a pretty good sized body of water at St. Quentin, and the French kept running around hollering, "German partey, German partey." And of course we didn't know what was going on, had no idea. Mixed up, and you know, this road we was on, we went right straight out there, and then there was a bridge across that river, and the Germans was going on the other side of the river, and they turned and went right into our convoy. We'd stopped, had about a 10-minute break, and there was a whole bunch of Germans got in that convoy the same direction and everything else that we was going. And first thing we knew, they hollered, "Okay, move out." And we just got started, and the small arms fire broke out. And of course we all jumped out and was taking up firing positions. We didn't know what had happened. And a German and American convoy ran right together. And an awful lot of their equipment was horse-drawn. They had buggies, they had 88s with trailers made to pull them, had tongue on them, and horses there, and riding horses, and just all kinds of horse-drawn equipment. There was a bunch of it. And it came in our convoy, the Jeeps, and all Jeeps had to have either a 50 or a 20 millimeter gun on it, and they had to have a gunner in place all the time. And these boys opened up on them Germans, and I never saw the odds so much against the Germans. They usually make their mark on people, but I'll tell you, this is one time that the Americans really raked them out, really got with them. And next thing we started moving right out, and here was horses, one of them had killed, and the other still fastened to him and trying to get loose. Germans strung all along the road on both sides, and we went through 3 or 4 little houses there and went up in there. And the next thing, the Germans were firing back on us, and there was a Colonel Cook that got his eye put out there. I was awful close to him. There was a German that threw a hand grenade over in closest, and buddy, they got Cook. He was from Philadelphia, and anyhow, we just stayed there overnight, and they pulled us back out of there, and we went someplace else up in the front line. But anyhow, we went into Belgium, and the first thing I knew, the first Belgian town that we went in, the first thing we saw was sort of a scaffold, and there was 3 people hung on it. That they had the hoods over their head, and evidently they'd had them on a truck or something like that, and drove out from under him or something of that sort. I don't know just how they had it. But that was the first sight we saw there in the town of Belgium. And just about the time we was getting in there was a Belgian man running around from one house to another. We was halted there for a while, and of course everybody didn't know what he was doing, you know, and buddy, we drew bead on him, and the officer run up to him and asked him what he was doing, and he was a telephone man, and he was making everybody disconnect their telephones, and which was a good thing. The people were there ringing church bells and really celebrating that they were being liberated. And I went along the street there, I was marching through there, and the first thing I knew, there was like a 9 or 10-year-old little girl run in and took a hold of my hand, and we tried to talk to one another. She was talking French and I was talking English, and we couldn't, and all I could say is no compris, and that's about what she'd say when I'd say something to her. But she had the cutest little pin on it. It was a Belgian flag, orange, white, and black, I believe, and I offered her some candy or some chewing gum for it, and she just grabbed it off and gave it to me right now, and I got to giving her candy. I gave her all that I had, and got some of the other boys to give her some. The first thing she knew, she had armloads of it. She never knew, she'd never had any candy for a long time, but they just didn't have things like that there. And well, I didn't know it, but there was a woman run in, evidently it was the mother, run in and tried to tell me to wait. She ran in ranks and told me to wait. And of course, they run over to the sidewalk, and then they took off and went up a hill. I saw them go up there, and of course the next thing was us. We had to move. Went a couple blocks and stopped again, and the first thing I knew, looked over on the sidewalk, and here came this woman. And she came running in the rank there and stuck her hand in my pocket, and here gave me 2 fresh hen eggs, which, you know, we didn't have anything like that. We had K rations, C rations, and hot rations of all kinds. A hen egg, we'd just never seen nothing like that up on the front line. And she had given me so much, because that would have been it had been a week's ration for them. I'm sure that they was rationed, and that would have been a long ration for them. And we just moved out just a little farther, and the Germans had left a couple of men, a couple of 400 or 500 yards up. They had a 88 gun, had a small arms fire, and they kept firing on us. And what we did, we sent a patrol off from the right and down through a field and way around, and went around behind them so we could corner them. And we went up past there, and right through a woods. There was a little, just a path, or a vehicle could go over it, but that's about it. But anyhow, we went away back of that, and back of them. We thought we'd trap that outfit and get them. And the first thing we knew, we got set up there and everything, and here come a German Volkswagen through there. It had a German officer and a man went through there, and why, here there was, right in our position. We was all around them, and we had no idea that there was a German. We knew that there was one someplace, but they'd come through our back. They was right in our position. They saw us about the same time we saw them. They run up to the house where this where they had this 88, and where there'd been firing on us. 3 or 4 of them got in that Jeep, or in that Volkswagen. They stuck these guns out the windows, and they backed off there. We'd fired on them a few times. We couldn't see them really. And the first thing we knew, that vehicle started back down through there. I mean, the driver was right at the wheel, and he was pouring the fog on it, and these burp guns was out the windows, and they was really popping. And our machine gun, of course, everything was set up on it. And they, of course, we got the Germans, but anyhow, you know, the driver headed right to our machine gun, and you know that he got 3 or 4 of our boys before we got it stopped. Of course, the car kept going. But anyhow, we took that position in good shape. And the next thing, we went ahead and on up through into Belgium. And really, I think that our division was the first one to ever go into this. Well, I want to tell you some more about always up in there. We got the oldest men in the outfit. We got to go back to Paris on a 3-day pass. They give you 72 hours in Paris, a 72-hour pass. So the boys in my squad told me to go ahead, and I did. I went ahead and went back to Paris, and I come back to the front lines on Thanksgiving Day. I had a real nice time. One of the things happened to me, I went to a restaurant in Paris, and some of the boys at the table next to mine ordered a bottle of champagne. Now, I had never seen a bottle of champagne. I didn't know how it was ordered or anything about it, but here it came in a big bucket filled with ice. And I said, gee whiz, they've got ice. I wonder if they'd have ice cream. And I asked the waiter if I had ice cream, and she no Capri. She couldn't she told me to wait. A little bit, some guy come back up there with a tray on his hand and tilting around through there, and he come up to our table and says, "Something you fellows wanted?" in English. And I says, "Yeah, I have ice. I wondered if I had ice cream." He said, "No, we have never seen ice cream here for the last 3 or 4 years." And anyhow, they didn't have the ice cream. But when we went back to the front lines on Thanksgiving Day. That was in '44, and our outfit had moved from where we was at, and here we was in the back end of trucks, the fellows that had been on the pass, and Buddy here was an officer with a map and a raincoat over him, and here he was trying to read that map. Somebody told him our position, and he was lost, and there were small arms fire about us, and they're all directions. And Buddy, I'm telling you, I didn't want to get caught there. The first thing I knew, they kept looking at their map, and next thing I knew, halt. And here it was, our positions. And we got up there, and it was after dark. And anyhow, when we got to our positions, they asked if we'd had supper yet. And of course we hadn't. And Buddy, our mess sergeant, the best kitchen force of anybody in the outfit, in the whole division, I'm sure, in our regiment, I know. But anyhow, the boys brought the eating out, and we had turkey and mashed potatoes and gravy. We had everything. I couldn't have had a better meal if I'd have been home. And that was the year that they had trouble with cranberries. There was something about the cranberries that they wasn't supposed to eat them, or there was a shortage of them or something. But Buddy, we had cranberry sauce, we had cake and pie and everything that went with it, all you could eat, and it was a good meal. But anyhow, that was up in the Belgium, and we went on in clear up to the close Siegfried line in Belgium, and we set up a line there. I think I knew about midnight they hollered, "All, we're moving out." And then we went on a patrol, our company, and went down and crossed a little cement bridge on a small road about like 74 out where I used to live. And we crossed the bridge. It was down over a hill and across this bridge and up on the side of the next hill. And we got clear up pretty close to the top, and we laid along the road, and they sent patrols out there. They went on up to the Siegfried line, went through the Dragon's Teeth and into there, and we could hear Germans. We could hear German vehicles out running around there. They went to 2 or 3 or 4 pillboxes. There wasn't no Germans around there, but we could hear them. But they come back, and we went back to our positions. And the next morning we got up real early and went back to occupy the pillbox. And the noise we'd heard the night before was Germans occupying them that night. And they run us back out of it. They really put the firepower on us. We didn't get to take the pill, didn't get to get into the pillboxes that day. But one thing about it, there was 3 or 4 houses as we crossed that little creek, and there was some kids about anywhere from 7 to 10 to 12 years old, and the boys was running around there, and their parents was trying to get them in. The boys was trying to take up arms and fight against us, and the parents was trying to get them to settle down. And anyhow, we had to get back in our old positions, and the boys, they could have damaged us, and we could have them because they knew the territory. We went from there. We moved out of there. Was there just a few days, and then we moved out of there, and General Patton had broken into the Siegfried line, and that's where the Dragon's Teeth and the pillboxes and everything were. And then we went into that, we went into the secret line. We got through the dragon's teeth, and we'd taken an awful beating, and we got the smaller pillboxes. It was covering the dragon's teeth, but on the back of there, they had these larger pillboxes. Some of them as big as a house, and there was a lot of them. They was awfully well camouflaged, and they had big guns in them. And anyhow, they kept they had us held down up in the secret line for so long. We fought there and had taken an awful beating. One time, someplace in the front in our section, we could watch it. Every night the Germans would put some kind of an attack on us. And it was always in another section. But one night, they put it in I Company. I was in I Company, 110th, 28th Division. And first thing we knew, we had men scattered around there, and we got different, we got some replacements. And there was a couple of them that was on duty that night. The night before, we'd been in there for several days, and they was taking some of us out and letting us go back and write letters home and take showers. And you know, I had gone back for that. They was taking one man out of a squad. I left my squad up front, and I'd been back for that. Some of the other boys had gone before. But anyhow, there was a couple Germans crawled down in our positions, and we had two men that hadn't been there very long, and anyhow they didn't know what was happening or anything. And what the Germans did, they pulled a half track up a hill from the other side and let it coast down, and they never had the motor running until they got pretty good in our positions. And they kicked that thing in gear, and the motor started up, and they had flamethrowers on it, and those flamethrowers would throw flames pretty near 100 yards. But anyhow, he put the fear in a lot of boys in our outfit, and they started to run, some of them. And there was a couple of Germans back of them, and they got so many of our boys there that night. We had a lieutenant that had been first Louis that had been with us for a couple of months, and he was such a good fellow, and he was awful good. We all liked him. He was sort of red-headed. And they brought the captain bars up and gave them to him the night before, and he got killed the next morning in that attack. And I had a boy in my squad. I had Kaiser and Kip and Lamb and Owens was the boys that was in my squad at that time. And Kip was a boy that had come through the replacement. He was a young fellow that probably 18 or 19 years old probably. And he just married and had a child. And the mail was just starting to come to him. Every time we'd get a mail call, he'd always get a group of letters. I believe his wife had wrote to him every day. And always in that outfit, in his letters, he would pretty near get a picture of his daughter and his wife. But anyhow, he got killed there, and I hated that so bad. Kip was his name, William P. Kip. He was such a nice fellow, but we lost him. And anyhow, we was there and taking an awful beating around there, lost several men, and we just had an awful time with it. And then they finally come up and relieved us. Another outfit came up, and we went in then to the Hurricane Forest. And that was where Germans was training for the boats, the breakthrough. We didn't know it then, but found out afterwards that that's where they was training. And we was in there, and it's a mountain section. There's a town by the name of Smith, and it was in the mountains, and just a few miles out of that there was plains, like flat territory. That's tank territory. And General Patton said, if you give me Smith, I'll give you Cologne. in 3 days. It was about 50 miles away or something of that sort. And anyhow, we was supposed to go in there and take Smith. And I'm telling you, those hills, and it was really mountains, and they were loaded with them Germans. And our company happened to be in, we got, first it was a battalion went up and they got clear in Smith. It's a company of tanks. It was 15 tanks and a half track, I believe it was. And there was 2 or 3 jeeps. But anyhow, they got up in there in the mountains and got the pickings beat out of them. Some of them got into Smith. And the last time we heard of them, they was begging for help, but they was going to have to give up. The Germans would sit close to the roads through the mountains, and they'd have these bazookas, and man, when one of our tanks come up, they'd just knock it out, knock everything out. And we were sent up there to relieve that outfit that had got in a trap. And we'd only got about halfway, and the first thing we knew, we was in the same trap. And we was there for 3 days and nights without anything, no supplies from any place. And anyhow, we survived that, and finally the Germans come up. There was 3 American tanks up above us on a hill. We went back in the woods and dug in real deep. It was up on a sort of a hill clear up the ridge. It was sort of cleared. Anyhow, there was 3 American tanks that come up there, and one of them would come up to the top of the hill and he'd fire a few rounds and drop back down, and one of the others would go up, and they kept doing that a good bit. The first thing you knew, one night we heard something. Before we went there, though, they told us we would not have artillery support. It was in the mountains, and we couldn't use artillery in the mountains. Here come something up the other side of the mountain. We heard it. We knew it was a German tank coming. And anyhow, the first thing, out with one of the tanks, a flare lit up. And buddy, I'm telling you, the German tank hit him and set it afire. And they knocked all 3 of our tanks out. And we sat there, and they told us to hold our fire, not give our positions away, hold our fire, everybody. Which is a big old boy from Kentucky. But he decided that the Germans was hollering at us, give up, Yank, give up, Yank. More blood for Hitler, and more blood for Roosevelt, you know. But anyhow, they were hollering at us, and no one said a thing. The first thing I knew, right, was within 20 feet, I may hear that American machine gun opened up. He started spraying the top of that hill. He was the assistant gunner. He should have never even had to hold the gun to begin with. But anyhow, he started spraying the top of that hill. And we did have a liaison officer, a field to direct artillery. And the first thing we knew, way back in the distance, we could hear our old 155s burping away, and they went over the top of it. They fired right over it and just started peppering the top of that hill. And the Germans withdrew and got out of there. And the next night we patrolled down out there, down off of a mountain, across the river. There was some troops come up to the bottom of the hill, and we were to get down from our side down to the bottom and cross over, and we're supposed to be in friendly territory there. And we'd been in there for 3 days and nights without anything to eat or drink. And the first thing I knew, we was going down this mountain, and people were dropping their helmets and was rolling over the hill, and making noise. We patrolled that night. So they told us to stop and put our helmets out behind a tree or fasten them some way so that they wouldn't get down bareheaded. And that's what we did. And I was going down, went clear down, we fell over cliffs and I don't know what all. And anyhow, we finally got down to the bottom, and buddy, I could hear this water running, this creek. I jerked my canteen out and started to drag it through the water. And would you believe I fell in that water? And me, rifle and all, went clear under. Or fell, it wasn't only about knee deep or just a little over your knees. It was about like Middle Island Creek. Evidently it was a riffle or something we went across. And I got on the next side and got behind a tree, my buddy and I. Glenn Barr was my buddy, he was from Harrisville. And he and I was together at that time, and Glenn had helped me down there, and we always slept together, and I always carried a raincoat. We had 2 raincoats and 2 blankets and a shelter half. And anyhow, we laid that thing down, and I was so wet, and it was cold. It was probably in the early parts of November, and buddy, I couldn't sleep. I was shaking so bad. I got a hold of a tree and just jogged in place the rest of the night. And we was in there when we went back into the hurricane force in different place. We went back through there, and we went to a place that there was a pile of American helmets piled up. There was 100 or more, a couple of hundred, I suppose, there. And we was to pick out a helmet and put it on and get our helmets, and took up positions again. And it was awful tough. Everything was tough there. And those hurricane force, those Germans, every once in a while, they'd throw over a bunch of stuff. Anyhow, we was in a position there, and our company was supposed to be in reserve. And you know, they would, when you're in reserve, any patrol went out, the company in reserve had to send it. And they'd sent 1, 2, and 3 men patrols out. Finally, they sent a whole platoon. The whole 3rd platoon was sent out, and never a time was there a man ever come back. The blacktop road along the mountainside, whenever those boys crossed the blacktop road, from there, buddy, something happened to them. Only one time we ever heard anything from them. We heard the barbed wire streak and some small arms fire. And that's the only thing we ever heard. The Germans had got them somehow. And there was never any shots fired. They'd drop down over there and they'd get them somehow. I don't know. But anyhow, we stayed there for a week, I expect, and the first thing you knew, orders come down for me they'd got 5 replacements for the 3rd platoon, and called me and told me I was going to be the platoon leader, and for me to go out around there and contact these 5 men. And I went around there, and the first thing I knew, the Germans started firing on us, and we was having an awful time with it. There was 2 or 3 of them killed that night, and the other 2 was wounded. But I came out of there somehow, I don't know. So I came back, I went to them and asked them their names and told them to get together and dig holes for themselves. And I started to dig with one man, and the first thing I knew, they got into a shell, and I knew where the holes were, so where I'd left from, so I headed back to it, and I got into it. And I left Barr, my friend from Harrisville, I left him in charge of my squad, and during the shelling, he got killed. And anyhow, we moved from there back. Finally, some outfit came in and relieved us out of there. We never did get Smith. And they took us up to a place in Luxembourg. And now we were in Luxembourg, right on a river. I forget the name of the river that separates Luxembourg and Germany. I just forget it. I've heard it a lot of times and everything like that, but I do forget the name of it. But anyhow, we were right just on the border of Germany in Wallerscheid, I think, or something like that. Wallerscheid Dick or Wallerscheid was the name of the little village. It was close. And while we were there, we had we weren't up to strength. There were supposed to be 286 men in a rifle company, and there wasn't 100. In our platoon, it was attached to, I believe it was the 3rd platoon. We had a machine gun section, 2 machine guns and 2 mortars that was attached to that platoon, and there was 35 of us. Then they had the 1st platoon and the other one, 4th platoon, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd platoon, what we had there. Anyhow, what it was, the 1st platoon had a little house, and around where it was at, they had their positions all set up, and then down the road a mile was our platoon, and we set up there, and then down the road another mile there was another platoon, and there was mile gaps between us, and the Germans knew our positions better than we did, and all the time we was there we had been taking such an awful beating, and the American people, the American officers, they all knew that this bulge, breakthrough was coming, and they'd taken us, because we was the weakest outfit that there was around any place, we'd taken such an awful beating. And while we were there, we had to salute our officers, and when you're in combat or even close to combat zone, you never do that, and you never, your bars and stripes and everything like that, we turn our field jackets wrong side out and make some of the men in your squad do that, and your bars was always hid underneath. I said yes sir or no sir or sergeant or nothing else to anybody like that. You just said Jim or Joe. But anyhow, while we was there, the first thing we knew, they begun to making us salute our officers, and we was right up on the front, and salute our officers and saying yes sir and no sir, and all of those things just not right. And at night we could look back over on the American side where we had liberated, and we could watch lights flicker, like Navy lights flicker signals. We could see it. We reported it to our officers, and we could watch them on the German side. They would flicker them right back, answer. And we saw that coming. We listened down to building the bridge across this river. We read all the time, and all the officers knew it. And in the position just past us, a place, there was a little side road there, and they had an anti-tank gun sitting there to cover this little road. And the Germans somehow slipped in on those boys, and this was in December, and there was 2 men out on guard. When we was there in those positions, that this anti-tank gun was out there, and you know the Germans, there was 2 men on guard, and something happened. Those Germans slipped up and got those 2 men that was on guard. The other boys was in a building sleeping, and you know they woke those fellows up, the Germans did, and marched them out of there barefooted, and it was frosty and cold and everything, and I just know that they marched them through the little German towns and said, look here, here's Americans up here barefooted, and didn't even have shoes, and I don't know what all they did to the boys, but they really made the Germans think that they was winning the war. Civilian people thought that because anyhow they kept shooting. there was a lot of stuff back and forth, and Germans was all around us, and we knew it, and everybody knew it. One time I was assistant gunner, a gunner on a Jeep. They had to have a 50 or a 20 millimeter gun and somebody on it at all times. And happened to be on the Jeep, and I sitting on the spare tire or something back there, and had that gun pointed up, and we went down the road, and a little ways we come back. And you know, first thing I knew, there was an awful squeaking noise, and I had that gun pointed up high enough that the Germans, they had pulled a wire across the road between two trees. It was in a sunken place, and of course you wouldn't see this wire when you was driving through there, and they'd put that up there just to catch me. There was a thing on the Jeep on the front end that would protect the driver, but I was up higher than him, and I happened to have the gun barrel pointed up in the air, and it caught the gun barrel and broke that wire. But was looking, the driver stopped, what the, and about that time he stepped on the gas, and out there he went, because there was no time to fool around there, because there was some Germans right close that would watch it. But anyhow, when they was the night before this bulge, the breakthrough came, they had sent me down there with the mortar section to fire 5 rounds. What I did, got about the middle of the range, and I fired 1 round. We couldn't see where we was firing. We had 1 scout out, but we had our shots numbered, and we were supposed to fire 1 shot and then go up 200 or 300 yards and fire another shot, and then come back to where we was at and down short and fire 1 round. Then we'd go up to the middle again and fire to the left and then to the right, and this. But one observer was out someplace where he could see that, and he was to tell us what shot was the closest and how far we were away. And the next morning we used to take 2 guns down there and fire 20 rounds apiece down on that bridge that they was building. But the next morning the Germans was firing on us. Morning of the breakthrough of the bulge started in about 6 o'clock before daylight or something like that. And the first thing we knew, boy, here come the Germans are firing over top of us. And of course, as long as there's missing, I was right up on the front. As long as there's missing, that was pretty good for me. I didn't worry about it. But I didn't realize that they had our artillery spotted. When they was flickering those lights, that was the thing that spotted our artillery. And but they was knocking our artillery out. Then the first thing we knew, just about daylight, here came the Germans coming over, and of course we kept firing on. We had them held back for a long time. In fact, we still there, but a bunch of them had patrolled through between our platoons, and they had patrolled through there, and they really captured our drum and bugle band 40 miles back in the rear echelons before they got us, right square on the front. The drum and bugle band that went back through there. We didn't have much back of us. It was back at Wilt's where they was at, band. But anyhow, we kept firing all that day, and I don't know, the night before it started, we got our Christmas candy ration. There was a great big box, it was 3 feet square, I expect, and it was full of big old D-bars and paydays and every kind of candy you can think of. And they had brought that up for us. That was our Christmas ration. That was near the about the 12th or 15th. Anyhow, they We captured a German officer that morning and a medico, and we had one German that was shot through the stomach or chest, and we had this medico, this German medico, and he'd look at him and say, "Bob," and he wouldn't even attempt to doctor him, but our medico did, and he worked with him a good bit. We gave these fellows a piece, and we treated them pretty good. This German officer tried to talk us into giving up. He told us how many troops was coming. We laughed at him. We didn't think that they had that many troops in Germany. Shoot, we just didn't believe him at all. We just laughed at him, made fun of him. And the first thing I knew, about 3 or 4 o'clock in the evening, we'd been firing on them all day. And our man with the radio was with us. We had 2 first lieutenants. One of them had come back the night before. He'd been wounded. And we had another first lieutenant who was our platoon commander at that time. And then this one had come back. We had 2 of them at that time. So anyhow, they was both there, and this house was in. And anyhow, we was trying to get communication with some of our artillery, or was calling for help. We told them we were surrounded. I could listen to that radio man. He was begging for help. And the last thing I heard on that thing was, "Troops and armored is on its way. Troops and armored is on its way." And it just was plain. And so next thing I knew, I heard the tank rumbling around. Boy, I thought, now this is it. But it was a German tank. And buddy, they threw a hand grenade in the window, and glass flew every place. But anyhow, one lieutenant looked at the other and said, "Well, we've got to do something, do it quick." It was all around us. And he says, "We're going to have to give up. So what are we going to do? Can anybody speak German?" And the fellow says, "Holler, comrade." And the next thing we all started hollering, hollering comrade. And we marched out there, tried to break our weapons up. And the last time I saw that radio man, he had that thing down on the floor and taking the receiver and beating the front of it and trying to tear that radio up. We broke our gun up as best we could and walked out with our hands up. And about that time, them Germans started running and screaming, and we was hollering comrade, and they come out and came over running at us with fixed bayonets, and we didn't have anything. But he went out there and stood there, and them German boys come out, and the first thing I knew, one of them got to searching. He searched me, jerked my watch out of my pocket, and looked at it. And we'd been running and falling. I had a good little Elgin watch set in Jewel, and it had stopped that day somehow. And he belly ached and stuck it back in his pocket. He listened, he saw it was dead, wasn't running. And I laughed at him. He turned around and booted me. Well, of course, it didn't make any difference to me. I wouldn't have hollered or done anything, but I laughed at him again. Buddy, and that time he booted me harder, and then he ran up in front of me with a gun. I had the gun right in front of me, and about that time a German officer grabbed a hold of him and made him get away. And I had my hands over my head. The boy stood right in front of me, he wasn't over 14 years old. I could have bashed him if he'd have touched anywhere close to the trigger, or his safety or anything. I was ready to hit him or kick him. I didn't know which to do. But I was going to do one of them. And anyhow, the German officer took him away from me. Boy, that was an awful shake to line up out there and the Germans run in on you. And this guy had searched me, and he was mad at me. And anyhow, they lined us up in the column of twos and started us out there, marching us back toward into Germany, back across that bridge that I'd been listening to them build. And anyhow, I was marching along there, and back in England, when we was back there was 4 or 5 of us boys' birthdays was in April. And I always told the boys that the war would be over for my birthday. And I was marching along there and looked over at one of the buddies that had been with me ever since we've been in the service from Kentucky. He says, "Denning, will she be over for your birthday?" And here I was marching toward Germany with my hands over my head. And anyhow, this guy that had that had booted me, one of the boys in my squad says, "Look out, Denning, there'll come a fellow after you." And I had my hands over my head, and I covered my face up, and he went off on the side opposite me and went clear up to the front of the column and come back down on the other side. And I kept my face covered up, and he didn't recognize me. But he had his gun in the ready position at that time, and I was really in trouble. But he didn't recognize me. And we went on out there, and I don't know, I never thought that I'd ever get through it, because I looked out there and we'd been a-firing all that day. And buddy, I didn't realize it. I never wasn't able to line the sights. It was 500 yards or a little better away from us, but everybody was a-firing, and I'm telling you, there was dead Germans laying every place. But anyhow, they took us out, and after they got us there, here come tanks and everything else, German stuff. They took us down, and we went across that bridge we'd been listening at it build. And they took us there to a little old barn and a garage overhead, bank barn of some kind you'd call us. The guy that was an old man that was a guard in this, he sat up there on some kind of a box or something, and he fell off of it during the night. And they had me back right up against the doors. And every once in a while, if I happened to move, it'd rattle those doors and he'd flashlight on me. But anyhow, later on in the night, that guy went to sleep and fell down in amongst the fellows, and his gun and flashlight and everything else was gone. They finally got it, and he got back in his position. But anyhow, we marched out of there, and the next day they was interrogating us. They took us to a farmhouse, and there was a little German, real thin, and he had real thick glasses, and he spoke limey English, and he was trying to find the Stars and Stripes that had told about the Americans building a gasoline line through through France to push the gasoline up in the front. And that's the question that he asked everybody in that whole outfit that day. He asked me where I was from and how long I'd been when I went to the service. He just told me my training for Camp Livingston and every place that I've been. He had all the training down. He asked me if I wished to belong to the Bloody Bucket Division. That was the Pennsylvania National Guard. That's what they called us. But anyhow, we survived that all right. No one knew where the gasoline line, no one had ever seen it. He just laughed. He says, "You know, these Americans are smart people," and just laughed. And he was trying to find out the gasoline line so they could tap it and get the gasoline. But anyhow, it marches out of there, and it marches into a farmhouse. Now the Germans we had air superiority. They could not move in the daytime at all because our planes were just picking up every place. There was little fighter planes just combing the skies and bombers, and these little planes, observation planes, if they saw a German tank, they had to have everything hid because they'd send artillery over and get it. But anyhow, they marched us into a little farmhouse, and there was 33 men and 2 officers, and the guard told us there's 33 men and 2 officers, and in the morning there'll be 33 men and 2 officers or else. So one of the officers spoke up and said, "Boys, we've give up, don't know crazy guy tried to get away. And anyhow, they marched along there. They marched into a little farmhouse. The room wasn't over 14 by 16. All 35 of us there in that room. And I mean to tell you, crammed up together, you couldn't sit down in the other place. Finally, the fellow came in and wanted to know if anybody could saw wood. And I volunteered for it. Crazy me. I went out and had a crosscut saw there, and they had the forks set up. A nice place to saw. And here they had a whole pile of wood, trees about 20 feet long and about 8 or 10 inches at the bottom, run clear out at the top. And there's another guy come out with me. We went out there and went to sawing that wood. And, you know, between the forks, had 2 cuts in there, and the saw would pinch, and you couldn't saw them clear off. And boy, the first one we sawed for about an hour, and my hands had blisters. I was tough, but I wasn't tough for that. But anyhow, I decided I needed a little rest on them. We'd been throwing those that hadn't been cut clear in 2 off in one pile, and the rest of it every place else. There's an axe laying there, and I grabbed that axe up and started to cut that, and the first thing I do, kept hollering at me, and the next thing I looked around, and buddy, that guard that was on us had a gun right on me. That axe handle got all hot right quick, and I dropped that thing and went to sawing. I wasn't supposed to pick that axe up. But anyhow, we went from there, and we went to, they loaded us on trains, and we went to Limburg, Germany. And Limburg, Germany, we was in there, got there about the 20th, or this was December the 16th, when we got captured. And we got on the train about probably around the 20th. Anyhow, we'd been in on this box Christmas in there, and the engine hauled us there to Limburg, Germany, and there they put us on siding. We were supposed to go to a prison camp there. It was 12 days, Limburg, Germany. And there was 2 carloads of us there. And if you ever seen people loaded in boxcars, you ever seen cattle? They try to get as many in as they can, and the German pushed us right up there and just keep shoving you and shoving you and shoving you. And closed the door on us, and bang she went, and there was no way of getting out, and we was in there till after Christmas, the 23rd of December 1944. The RAF come over and bombed us. We'd been watching a factory out there where the Germans had been working in. They came out and they had an air raid shelter under the prison camp. And anyhow, whenever the siren would blow for air attack, they'd come out of this factory and run back in this air raid shelter under the prison camp. But anyhow, all at once, the 23rd of December, the Protestant boys had said the Lord's Prayer, and the Catholic boys had passed a rosary around when it was dark, when it was light. And all at once, about 9 o'clock that night, we heard this siren blow. We'd been hearing it for a day or 2. The first thing we knew, somebody hollered, "Look!" And looked out there, and you know that they dropped a flare on a parachute, and just lifting up just like day. And the next thing we knew, here come them bombers in. There's RAF English bombers, and they come in, and you could really hear the bomb come out of the plane. Made an awful racket. But anyhow, they was a bombing, and this factory is what they was bombing at. And of course, we thought that they was bombing for the railroad yards, and buddy, we was in them. And we were locked up in those boxcars, and I'm telling you, it was an awful mess there. But they did hit the factory, and they just split it open. We always said like a banana peeling. But anyhow, they hit it and hit it right. And if he's ever in a bombing like that, I'll tell you one thing, those bombs really do shake the ground. There's an awful railroad part that really shake. And they left us in there, them cars, till, I think around the 28th or 29th, because I moved to someplace on the 29th, and that's when they took our pictures and really made our prison record. There was boys that told us, now he says, you don't have to do that. The only thing that you're required to do is the name, rank, and serial number. But if anything happens to you, there will be no report on it. So I went ahead and finished it out, and I was able to bring the prison record home with me. I've still got it. I treasure it very highly. And it has a German prison number on it, and American number, and in case of emergency or death or anything, to who to notify, and had some information from one camp to another when we moved. So I really kept that. It has my picture on it, and it was taken the 29th of December. Still like 4A, I believe it was, or 4B. We went from 4B to 4A, or from 4A to 4B, I don't know which it was. And anyhow, when we was moving from one camp to another, they hauled us on train. But every once in a while, there'd be a trainload of those Jews go by, and they was screaming and hollering, and they was in worse shape than we were. For Christmas Day, 1944, there was 12 of us divided a loaf of that German black bread, and it was just a skinny little slice apiece. And we never had water to go with it. That's how we had our Christmas 1944. But anyhow, we set a camp, and we stayed there a few days. Then they moved us to another camp, and first the orders come down that non-coms and the privates would be separated. And one of the boys in my squad says, "Denning, let's all stick together." And I looked at him, and there was nothing I could do about it. I was a sergeant. They marched me off, and he had big tears in his eyes, and I hated to see it. We were good friends, awful good friends. And anyhow, there we did sleep in barracks, and there were springs, slats and springs. There was nothing laid on top of them, and they did try to feed us about halfway. In one place they fed us cabbage soup, and didn't have very much cabbage in it. It was mostly water, but it did have some of these worms, where they were cooked, and it would be bleached out white, and there would be some boys holler, "Yippee, meat in the soup today," and others would stand there and throw the things out, but you never saw anybody throw the soup out. We all ate it, and then when we started to move from that camp to another, first thing they gave us a can of meat. Something like cram or something of that sort, and they'd always give it to you between two people. You had to divide it, and they'd do that to make you bring a fight over who got it. And my buddy and I cut the can half in two, and it was awful cold. And I had an overcoat. They had given me an overcoat. I forgot what nation it was. It wasn't a German. It wasn't Polish. But anyhow, an old blue overcoat, and I stuck that can of meat down in my pocket. It was so cold, I knew that it wouldn't spoil, or I just felt that way about it. We was on this train for 2 or 3 days, and finally they pulled us into a yard, and was going to unload. And that's when I ate my meat. And about 10 o'clock that night, my stomach went to cramping, and anyhow, I went to throwing up, I had ptomaine poison. Sure.
And her opponent to breathe.
Anyhow, I knew it was ptomaine poison. But anyhow, I went to throwing up and running out, and there was only one commode in that whole building. It was a great big building, like a gymnasium or something like that, a big hall. And there wasn't anyone hardly that made it to the restroom. There was stuff every place. And it was an awful mess. And there was not a piece of paper, nothing to clean yourself with. And I bore that. I got captured on the 16th, and probably before that a little time I had probably changed the clothes. And I bore that. I got captured on the 16th, and probably before that a little time I had probably changed the clothes. But anyhow, I never got my clothes changed. I had the same clothes on till June 8th. When, no, it was May the 8th, the day after the war was over, that I really got to change clothes. And anyhow, I had those clothes on all that time. They had never been washed. And we had, on 2 different occasions, they took us, they called it delousing us, because everybody had lice. There was no disgrace to have body lice. They were just little tiny bugs, as less than wood ticks, or little flat wood ticks. I know that I sat there, I was liberated in April, and a few warm days I'd take my underclothes off, and in the seams they'd just be filled with those little black things. I'd sit there and pop them things for an hour at a time. But anyhow, the next morning after this episode with this ptomaine poison, evidently, I don't know whether I passed out or went to sleep or something. Anyhow, next morning they come in, awakening us up, and hollering roll call, roll call. Had roll call the morning and evening. And anyhow, those Germans come in there, and I started to get up, and I couldn't make it. I couldn't make it up. I tried 2 or 3 times, got up on my knees and I fell down. I couldn't do it. And the German come through, and he says, "Kronk," sick in German, "Ja." And he booted me a little bit with his toe and get up, and I started to get up again, and I couldn't make it. He says, "Kronk," and turned around and walked out, and there were 4 or 5 of us in there that way. And anyhow, he came in and counted us, went outside and counted us, come back in and counted us, run around there counting for a good while, and then everybody come back in. And one of my buddies someplace, after he come back in, I asked him to help me. And I got up on my feet and got to walking around. I was better. I pulled through it all right. Of course, he was hungry and starved. And anyhow, we stayed in that camp for a week or 10 days. Anyhow, it was the 2nd day of 1st of February, Groundhog Day, 1945. They started moving us from that camp to another one. It was Camp 3A. It was at Limburg. It was at Lutenwald, Germany. It was about 20 miles or 30 kilometers directly south of Berlin. And they marched us 100, it was 100 mile. I did 30 mile when I was in the American Army, and a time or 2. But 100 mile we only did 10, we did it in 10 days. I know they pulled us out and they lined us up in 100 column of 100, and then they'd waited, and there's somebody searched you. There's 2 Germans that searched us, and whenever they'd get the 100 searched, they'd send them out. And it was that way. Clearly they got the whole bunch. There was 3,500 men that they started out that way. We was all non-coms. They separated the non-coms from the privates. The privates had to work. They would set out trees and stuff like that. Some of the boys told me about it later, that they'd be setting out trees, and the German guards would sort of make fun of them, and some of the boys would set the trees in upside down and set the tops in the ground, and some of the German guards would laugh, and the crazy Americans didn't know how to do it, you know. Then others of them would pull a gun on you, and you'd see them turn them back over and set them in first, set them in right. But anyhow, we went to Lutenwald, 3A, and that's where I was liberated. We were just directly south of Berlin. They marched us through there 10 days, and the first 3 days they never give us anything to eat. But I was marching along there, and they kept us in the farm barns, stuff like that. We never went to a house. But anyhow, this barn had a great big rolling door on it where you could, the horses and all kinds of machinery in the barn. It was in the main part of the barn where after these doors rolled back from the wind to blow and the snow. And it was a terrible cold and froze. I looked down below me a little place in a garden down there as we marched in, and here was a big mound. I knew there was something buried in there. I didn't know whether it was cabbage or Rudy Baker's, or just what it was in that. It might be apples, you know. Anyhow, I saw that. After midnight, when everybody was asleep, Buddy, I crawled down to that place, and I dug my arm back in there, and Buddy, it was potatoes, and I opened up my shirt and rolled about 3 or 4 of them potatoes in there, and I come back, crawled back up to that barn, covered my head up, and sat there and laid there and ate those potatoes. Those as sweet as any brown sugar lump that I ever chewed on, and I know that they was good. But anyhow, about the next evening or 2 after that, the guard was hollering at us, who was it got in the potato hole? And it seemed like no one knew anything about it. But anyhow, while we was marching along there was snow and cold. And it was a terrible, and these German, there was one officer who would just ride down along the column of horses, and you had to get out of the road. But these horses, I mean to tell you, they went. And he'd ride up and down along there and make sure everybody was accounted for and everything. And when we was marching from one camp to another, they had a guard on the front line, and then back on the left side there'd be the 5 back, there would be a guard, and then 5 back of that there'd be another guard. And we had him walk in the best walking positions. We couldn't walk in the tracks or anything like that. We had to walk on the sides of the road and stuff of that sort. But just a couple days before we got into the camp, they come out with a soup, and our guard said the son of a gun that got in the potato hole, he wouldn't even take us there. And some of the boys got 2 cups of soup that night. It was in different columns. But anyhow, when we got to 3A, it was a place that was a camp that they had tents 100 feet long, 25 feet wide, 500 men to a tent. And we filled them up. There's 3,500 of us. And on the ground there was just straw. And anyhow, we piled that up and laid down on it on 2 different First thing you knew, the straw was all broken up. You just couldn't hardly find any of it. You had it under your blanket. It was on the ground. And anyhow, this straw was just all eat up, and it was full of lice. And oh my, they took and deloused us twice. But whenever they give you a shower, and they took your clothes and put them in a steam vat of some kind, they didn't wash them. But anyhow, in the steam vat, you had to sit there in the shower room for about 2 hours after you got your shower. And whenever you take a warm shower and you're weak and hungry and everything like that, you get fainty. And I did that twice. And after that, whenever they called if you wanted a shower, I never went. But anyhow, I had a ringside seat for the bombings of Berlin. The RAF bombed at night, and the Americans bombed in the daytime, and they seemed to use our camp. They'd come in there, there's big old planes that just droned through there, just like a couple of GI trucks pulled up against the side of the hill, the throttle pulled out, and just sit there and roar all day. If it was a nice day, by 10 o'clock in the morning, the bombers would be there, and no German could get out and shoot up at them, any of them, because there was little fighter planes just combing the sky, just running every place around them. And if anybody shot at them, they'd just drop right down and get him. It didn't make any difference if he went in a culvert or in a house or anything. They'd just drop an egg on the house, and it would disappear. But anyhow, they couldn't even fire back at them. They was in a desperate position at that time. And anyhow, we was there in April, before it was liberated. It got warm. We had 2 faucets, water faucets, and most of the time you could go out and get a drink of water. But after it got warm, these tents was just off to the side built on the side of the regular prison camp. And we just got the water that they wasn't using up there, and the next thing we knew, on a good warm day, the water just trickled. It'd take you 5 minutes to get enough for a drink, and there'd be a line there behind you. You couldn't go ahead and fill your cup up. You'd get about a half a drink, and that was it. And it went day and night that way, and it was pretty tough living in there. We couldn't have lived another 10 days in there at all. Everybody had been fighting over a drink of water. But anyhow, we got a lot of dysentery. Some people would get something in, would take a drink of water, and you'd see him roll his eyes around and holler, they had a bridge built out and a pole for you to dump over, and no paper. And anyhow, you'd run out there and it'd just run through them. Drink of water would just run through them like fluid. Just nothing else with that. And that, one of our tents that blew down, we called it the medico tent. And there was some medicos there, and the boys would go in there, and just in a few days, of course, and the Russians did all the work there. They would come around with a big wagon, horse-drawn wagon, and there'd be a half a dozen of them or more around it, and they'd load the body in there, and out to the side we could see them digging graves out there. And they'd have a blanket wrapped around them, and the first thing you know, they'd come back and try and sell somebody a blanket. The Russians would. But anyhow, we was there till we was liberated. Before it was liberated or anything, I was liberated the 22nd of April. It was 2 days before my birthday. And anyhow, we had a man, one of the prisoners, would come through and tell us the news, the correct news. He had a radio or something, someplace that he read news and he got it right. And it was in there, in that camp where that the German come in one morning and says, your president, Roosevelt, has died. And of course we didn't believe it or anything like that, but anyhow, a little afterwards, or when our news come in, the man really told us that our president had died. But anyhow, on the 22nd, we woke up one morning, we were supposed to have roll call about 7 o'clock. And you know, we went out and looked, and there was no German guards. In the towers, they had these towers just like they do in a regular prison camp. And there was men in top of that and with machine guns, and there was dogs. A man walked around the camp all the time on the outside with a German police dog that was really rough. Go around close to the fence or he'd jump at you. And anyhow, I walked around the camp every day. I kept exercising. And anyhow, the morning that we were supposed to be, or we was liberated about 9 o'clock that morning, everybody got to hollering and around, and no guards, and we didn't know what was coming off. The first thing we knew, here come a Russian tank. It was American made. Come in there and barbed wire gates. Buddy, he flattened them things out. I mean to tell you, come through there. And we was liberated then. And the Russians wanted to take us back through Russia, a seaport in Russia, Odessa. And our horizon, we had some American officers there, and they asked just to wait till the Russians and the Americans met and let the Americans come in and haul us out. And they agreed to that, and they tried to feed us, but the Russians lived off the fat of the land. They just went through, and every house they run in, and anything in there to eat, they ate it, and they called it confiscating. If they had 10 chickens, they killed 9 of it, and some other guy just knocked the other one off. 2 cows, they killed one of them, and then the other 2, and they'd take their horses or anything that they had in the house to eat, they'd eat it. And they really was hard on the German women too, because the Germans and the Russians were fighting a grudge war. The Germans went a long ways back into Russia, and they treated the Russian people terrible. And buddy, when the Russians come back, they was treating the German people terrible. Anyhow, we stayed in the camp, and we just run around there like wild. A few days before that, we saw the Russians are planting potatoes out in the field close there. And a bunch of us went out and we dug those potatoes up that they had planted. Now, I bet they didn't have very many of them ever come up. And anyhow, we stayed there till I believe it was the 7th of May, the day that the war was over. When the Russians and the Americans met, it was close to Jitterball, and it was about 30 miles from where we was at. And it ended up that, one thing I want to tell you though, I saw the biggest ox that I ever saw. Those Russians were leading toward the kitchen. That thing had hip bones sticking up. I mean to tell you, it should have made a lot of soup, but that was about all. It didn't have any meat. But anyhow, it was the biggest ox. I think that thing was 30 feet long. But anyhow, it was leading toward the kitchen when I saw it. And on the 7th of May, the day the war was over with Germany, the Americans come in with some trucks, and they didn't have half enough. When we went in, and first you couldn't even jump up on a truck like an ordinary person would do. He was too weak and everything. We'd scoot one man up on it, and then he'd help pull the others up. And anyhow, we loaded on the truck, pulled the seats down, sat down, and the lower half of them left. And an officer got out and he says, "Boys," he says, "we're not pulling out of here until every man is on the truck." And raised the seats up, and everybody stood up. And 2 or 3 or 4 in the seats of there. and anybody that had a baggage of anything, they pretty near they threw them out. I had a little bag of stuff. After we was liberated there at the Luton Wall, I went down in the town, and there was a big building there that had the pins, German pins, had the swastika on it. I got about a dozen of those things and stuck them in this little package that I had wrapped up somehow. But anyhow, I had that, and I held to it. And I brought those pins home, and I've given to some of my nephews and some of the kids around, but I still have 2 of them, or 3. But anyhow, they hauled us to Magdeburg, Germany, and here come these planes over this morning. When we got to Magdeburg, Germany, they stopped along the road to give us a break, and there's some German women come out and hollered the war's over. And that was the day that the war was over, but we went ahead and went to Magdeburg, Germany. And that morning, it was a nice morning, and here come a rumor down there's going to haul limeys out that day. There was awful nice barracks there. And the rumor come around there's going to haul these limeys out that day, and I hadn't had my hair cut, and buddy, it was starting up. Come down and started up. I'd be in style with it today, but at that time I wasn't. And the biggest part of me then was my temper. I decided I didn't even have any money, and I couldn't even speak German. But I went down through the town and found a barber shop, and I was wanting my hair cut. And I was sitting there about the time that getting close to my time. I just wondering what the world I was going to clean that barber shop out if I didn't get my hair cut. But anyhow, about the time I was in there, and they had signed us to planes, 25 men, I think, something like that, to a plane, the C-47s. And an AMP come running in and says, any number is up to 350 to get to your plane. And boy, out of there I took. I went out to the barracks where I was at, and nothing was there but the little bag of stuff that I had. And here they was lined up, getting on the planes. I heard them hollering, Denning, Denning. And man, I went up trying to run down through there, and I finally got there, and this officer hollered, Denning's not here, and I hollered, yes he is. And I just went out and got on that plane, and that thing was just waiting there for me. I can out there to, I'd never rode in a plane like that before, and I didn't know. I looked up and sort of lattice work around in the plane. And anyhow, I asked, well, where's my parachute? I thought everybody got on there without a parachute. And the boys got to laughing at me, asked me if I'd jump if I did have one. I says, no, I believe I'll just ride her till she stops. But anyhow, they took us into Le Havre to Paris, France. They flew us there to Paris, France. They refueled there, and the people on the plane was, they brought them out food. Big sandwiches, great big old white bread that I've never seen for so long. And this, it was just, they bellyached about that old sandwiches and stuff, and they gave it to us boys. We divided it up. So it just tasted like cake. And then we got out, got back on the planes, and we still stayed on while they fueled. But anyhow, they took off from there and took us to Le Havre, France. Camp Old Gold, and they was set up there for us. They was waiting for us, but we got in there, and they had Germans on the chow line. The first thing they did, they took us to a shower place, and you throwed all your clothes in one pile, your underclothes and your overcoat and pants and everything. They went in one pile, went in the shower, and they got a real good shower. And when you got out of that, they turned around and dusted you just like you dust an old cow under your arms, your head, and just dusted you all over. And went through a line, you clean underclothes and everything clear up. new uniform, a new mess kit, and everything clear through. Loaded us back on trucks and hauled us out to a large camp. It was Camp Old Gold. And there they unloaded us off the trucks, and I noticed my tent was torn over the top. And the fellow that was driving the truck says, "Boys, down yonder's the mess hall. You can get down and eat anytime." And man, there was a mess hall. I mean to tell you, we went down there. Me and there's 4 of us boys went down together. And I went through that chow line, and there was Germans that was working KP there. And here they was, slick and all dressed up and everything. And buddy, we got to hollering at them, and they took those fellows out of there. Because we Germans, we grudged them. We just didn't want to have anything to do with them. And they put Americans back on KP, and I know I went through and filled the bottom of my mess kit up and the top of it, where there's those two places there where the handle goes on. There was a big old colored boy on those peaches, and those great big half-size peaches. And he says, "Tell me, boy, when you're hoiting." And he piled the peaches on there as long as they'd stay. And I moved out just a little way. There's an acre of tables. As soon as I saw a vacant place down, I went and buddy, I swallowed her up. And I went back through and even got a few more, some more stuff. And I tell you, my stomach was so full, it just felt so good it hurt. And even a big canteen cup of coffee with sugar in it. I never drank sugar, but there was sugar in my coffee, but it was good. And I started back to my own tent, and I never even knew which direction I came from. And I spent an hour running around to find my tent. I kept hollering for the boys, and the other 2 went right to their tent, and me and one of the other boys couldn't find it. We was there for over an hour. Finally found their tent, laid down on my little bunk, and I laid on my stomach and just pretty near tilt. And boy, I just felt so good, it really did hurt. And I had the first meal then, and I was through with the body lice. I didn't have any more of them. And then from there, they assigned us all to the ones that went to Eden, Fort Meade, Maryland. They got on a boat, and we come just a few days after that. It took us 17 days coming back, but it only took us 16 days of going over. But anyhow, we got on this boat, and I met a boy from Ravenswood, Mitchell boy, and I rode back and sat on the back of the boat and on the front of the boat. We had to work KP. Everybody had to work KP one day when we was on the ship coming back. And I was supposed to go there, I don't know what day of the week it was, but anyhow, I went in there about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. The old mess sergeant opened up a thing and he says, "There you are, peeled potatoes." There was a big old 100-pound of potatoes there. Oh, by 9:30 or 10 o'clock, I had them done. I thought, buddy, I was through. I hollered, "Yippee, I'm done." He reached up and pulled an arm down, and buddy, clear back through there with bags of potatoes, 100-pound bags. He dropped another down there for me. And I think that day I peeled, I believe it was 300 pounds of potatoes. That was my day on KP. But anyhow, I got along pretty good on that. Went back to Fort, we sailed, we come into Camp Miles Stanish, the same place I'd sailed from. And I got a train. I called the folks from home. I tried to call Cliff Wilson's. We at home didn't have a telephone. But anyhow, I tried to call Cliff Wilson's. And my sister Pauline was up at Washington, D.C. And they was getting ready to give up there when I was captured, and I didn't know that they lived there yet. So I kept trying to call Wilson's, and it never did get through. They never got any answer. So I'll never forget, Atlantic 0996 was their number up at Washington with Sister Pauline, and I had the operators to try that. And Mary Nell answered. She and I married brother and sister. And I asked if she knew who it was, and she says, "Yeah, it's Carlton, my younger brother." I says, "No, it's Maughan." She says, "Maughan?" And I heard Pauline and Mary Leah running through the house, my two sisters. Maughan? Pauline got on the phone and was talking to me. I told her I couldn't tell her where I was at or anything like that, but anyhow, I came to they gave us a partial payment there, and some boys had been captured 2 years. And anyhow, they took us, loaded us on trains to come to Fort Meade, Maryland, and they stopped in Philadelphia. And they said it'd be an hour's layover, but you could go in town there and get something to eat. Of course, about 3/4 of the fellows headed for beer joints. And when I went in, I went in beer joint too. And when they found out a bunch of us was in 28th Division, that's the Pennsylvania National Guard, first thing I knew, that table was just piled up with beer. I drank one or two maybe. But anyhow, I didn't drink much of it. And the rest of them, so many of them just got drunk. And the first time that they'd ever had anything to drink for years. And that train didn't leave out of there till about 2 o'clock. But I did call Pauline and tell her where we was going. I wasn't supposed to do it because the war was still going on with Japan. And anyhow, after I got to Philadelphia, I called and told Pauline where I was at and where I was going. I'd want her to meet me. So we went in there that night to Fort Meade. We had to fill out forms. And most of the fellows just went in there, they just destroyed that train. They put their fists through all the glasses and the windows, and they got into fights. There was an officer was a hitting pretty good, or he wasn't a hitting, but somebody else was a hitting. He had a good bit of money on the floor, and they wouldn't fade him, and he called him chicken. And the officer says, "Buddy, you no one calls me chicken," and into it they went. They fought through till we got to Meade. And when they opened the train doors up at Fort Meade, they just fell out of the train fighting. There was fights every place. And anyhow, the MPs says, "Boys, if you don't straighten up, we're going to send the MPs after you. We're going to get a company of MPs." And they said, "Bring them on." But anyhow, we got in the truck and they took us into the camp and we filled out forms. I went around and helped several fill the form out. And they'd have furloughs the next morning. And they did have furloughs the next morning, and I called Pauline and Mary Lee, or some of them came and got me and took me to Pauline's. And from there, I got on home. I had a 60-day furlough, 6 days traveling time, and was supposed to report to Miami Beach for a rest area. Then when I got over that, I come home, and I've been home for 60 days and reported to Miami Beach, and they was discharging on the point system. And I had 87 points, and 85 was the thing, and I was to report back to Washington, D.C. and get a train from there to Miami Beach, I guess it was. That's before I went to, when I was getting on the train to go to Miami Beach. And the war was over with Japan. And I didn't want to get on the train to go any farther, but they just about shoved me on. So I went down there, and then a few days after that, I got my discharge from the Army. And that's my story. I hope you all enjoy it, and so forth and on. And